Hey everyone, we are live. This is Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall, and this is We Made This Political. This is actually episode 3, so you should sound us on Substack and we hope, any of your favorite podcast platforms. Thank you for joining us. Today, Laura and I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think this kind of connects to our conversation last week, Laura, in that we were talking sort of about that connection between, or rather the distinction between control versus agency in both politics and parenting. And then today, I think we were interested in exploring a little bit about what we're thinking of as sort of the relational aspects of politics. And this came up in, I think, the podcast. And so I don't know if you want to kick us off just talking a little bit about where you see relational politics being most important or how you think about the phrase relational politics.
Actually, I thought what made me think this was a good topic was because we spent all this time last time talking about what is wrong with control. And I was realizing maybe the next question should be, what do we want instead? What are we trying to do instead? Here is my hot take. I'm not the only person who says this. I've heard other people say it, and it's like one of these truths that kind of follows you around.
Yeah.
At least that's been my experience. So I would say the opposite of a relationship is control. Like you can't have both. Those are, to me, in opposition to one another. It makes a lot of sense to me that there are settings where we think control is going to solve our problems, but it rarely does, or at least it doesn't solve them in a really productive way. I'm curious if you have heard this saying before and if you agree with what I've just proposed, like this tension.
Well, I think I agree, but I am interested because I think there's a lot of people for whom relationship and control, they are compatible, right? I don't know many, fortunately, but I do know some people who feel as though, and I think we see this in controlling and abusive relationships, but even in terms of the way that people think about both parenting and politics is that there is this element of control in both of those relationships. I don't know if you want to dig in a little bit more in terms of why you see relationship and control as being incompatible.
Okay. One primary driver of this has been my experience parenting, where what I observe in parenting is the more I insist on determining what is done and when, the more I'm overriding good reasoning coming from my kids. It's actually about whose preferences should govern, right? And my preference for you to not leave wet towels on the ground, like that's an area of control where I'm comfortable being like, nope, we're just not going to live like that. But then there are areas where it's like, okay, if I asked you to empty the dishwasher, do I need that done in this very moment? Ideally, what would happen is we have the kind of relationship where my kids feel like it's a good thing to contribute to the household. It's a good thing to not be agents of chaos in the home. That's making things better for everybody, not because they have to or they'll get in trouble, but because that's how we live together. I recognize that this is a little bit of a reach for how people live together when they are citizens instead of in the same household. But I've started to think, does that have to be so utopian? Maybe I should confess a soft spot for utopian communities over time that started with my undergraduate political science experience, for sure.
Interest. For my first book, I did a little bit of qualitative research on intentional communities, did some really interesting interviews. That term intentional community is also commune in a lot of situations. Talking to people at those communities was really interesting and I think powerful about intentional communities because of the way that they're like totally voluntary. And this leads me to the point that people see control and relationship as sort of overlapping. And there's actually a long history of this in political science and political theory. If you go back to, for example, the founding era or even further back to Aristotle, the idea is that if you rely on control for to get people to obey, we call that tyranny or despotism, but it's also fundamentally unstable, right? It's unstable because people resist, people push back because people have an instinctive desire to not be controlled. And so there's always this hard balance. This is where I think a lot about sort of politics in terms of unstable equilibria. Like we're always kind of trying to find this balance. And I think parenting is actually very much like this too, where there are certain things we do need. Like, I just need my kids to follow directions most of the
Mhm.
time in order to make sure that the family like moves. When you can get voluntary obedience, when kids or citizens or just the people that you work with voluntarily do what needs to get done because it's for the good of the community,
Mhm.
the workplace, or the family, that's when you get a real relationship. That kind of voluntary obedience to norms and laws and values, most of the time, and here I'm drawing on Edmund Burke and some other folks, comes because you have an affection for the other person. True relationship helps develop that kind of voluntary, okay, we're all in this together. I need to appeal to
Mhm.
both your reason and your affection to
Mhm.
get all of us to do the things that we need to do. I think the research on authoritative parenting suggests something very similar, which is that it's not that you're constantly appealing to your kid's reason via logic, but there
Mhm.
is this relational understanding that we're all in this together, which is why I might sacrifice my temporary well-being to, pick up my shoes in the middle of the floor so that my parents don't
Right.
die
Trip and
every
fall.
morning. Tripping. So my kids and I have not gotten there yet, but at some point they will feel that sense of solidarity to pick up their shoes. We'll get there eventually. I don't know if that
Yeah.
helps what you're.
Yeah. No, some other words that I think go with that are like voluntary, like you said, but also like cooperative, right?
Mhm.
That everybody is working together to accomplish something. And ideally in your family, it's going to be something like a peaceful household where everybody feels comfortable and free to be themselves, right? And also to not have moldy towels and tripping over shoes. So, and like cooperative, right? Like that those things are also and so I guess control to me feels like the opposite of cooperative. Control is I don't trust you, so I'm going to have to ensure that you behave the way that I want. And it also
Mhm.
kind of assumes that the way I want is preferable, right? Which of
Right.
course in parenting is sometimes the case. I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about in parenting is w- the reason my kids do things matters to me. It's like,
Mhm.
I don't want you to not hit your siblings because you're going to get in trouble. I want you to not hit them because they are other human beings and we don't right, do physical violence on one another.
In
So I
theory.
think
In theory, we
in
don't do
theory,
physical violence on each other.
um, I mean, in full disclosure, there's a lot of physical violence between me and two younger brothers when I grew up. So I'm trying to do something very different. But yeah, that reason actually matters. And that has surprised me in parenting to
Yeah.
recognize, oh, I want them to do what I want, but for the right reason, not just because it's costly to disobey me.
Mm.
Right. And so there is this kind of like space too, and what we're talking about here for considering what would be well-being for other people, right? Like control ignores that.
Yes. All of my kids are now at or above what is sometimes called the age of reason. So, like, sort of
Mhm.
7 upward, roughly. And, one thing I noticed as my kids got older was they would misbehave or break a rule or norm or something or some sort of expectation. But it did become more important for me to ask them why. So,
Mhm.
before I came out swinging, like, in timeout or whatever we were doing at that time, which never actually worked that well. But I actually wanted to know this is particularly important because I have that spirited child in the middle, the spicy one, where she actually has this like really, and I'm not saying my other kids don't, but she has this like very complex internal
Mhm.
space. And so if you, it actually is this really, it's almost like physics in action where if you react to her behavior without investigating what's going on inside, you simply get an immediate counter response. She will not, which I think makes a lot of sense. For her, it's really important that she's heard. And I can
Mhm.
then figure out, okay, I understand that you were feeling that way, but this is not an appropriate response.
Right.
Here's what we need to work on. Here's what we need to think about next time. But if you don't do that work with her, it escalates times like 1,000. That has actually been interesting. She has probably changed my parenting more than any of the other kids because they're just much more easygoing. And so they
Mhm.
don't have that immediate like pushback
Mhm.
where it's like she doubles and triples down on stuff. So I think that's really interesting too, is trying to animate their reason, getting them to do some self interrogation at what's going on and why they're doing this, but then also trying to figure out how we can avoid this kind of conflict in the future. And you and I touched on this last time, which is one of the things that I think we really fail on in public policy, which is we often do not do that basic investigation of like, hey guys, why are you breaking the law in the first place? Why is this law completely ignored or whatever the situation is? We look at policy failures and very often, not always, there's some people that do really good work in this area, but very often our immediate response is, well, let's double down. Let's make the consequences tighter. Let's put more law enforcement on it. When we haven't done that basic step, which we should be doing with our kids, and we don't do it with our fellow citizens, and asking them, like, what are you thinking?
What's happening here?
Yeah, like, what are your goals? Why do your goals and preferences not line up? And sometimes people will just say, I'm just doing the wrong thing. People who are texting while they're driving or whatever. And then you can come up with, why don't you put your phone in the glove box or whatever, But other times I think people really do have logical and very reasonable arguments for why they're not following the law. They're whatever it is that they're pushing back on. So I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that.
No, that's a really interesting parallel that you're drawing. This is an authoritarian approach, right? To be like, well, let me devise a punishment that will prevent you from doing this. And it does assume that there's a rational reason, which there may or may not be, especially where kids are involved. That was reminding me of last weekend. We were dyeing Easter eggs and ended up with this massive argument between my oldest and youngest child. There's crying, there's yelling, it's a disaster. And later, my youngest kid came back and said, well, I was jealous because he was dyeing his Easter eggs better than I was. Right? I could never have dreamed up that explanation for why we were getting bad behavior in that moment. You need to ask your middle child. If I had reacted with punishment in that moment, it would have just been 1,000 times worse. What I did was send everybody to their rooms. And that is my best parenting intervention. I need to go to my room. I don't even care if anybody else goes to their room.
I was reading something on the internet yesterday that was talking about sort of like fail-safe parenting axioms. There are a couple. One, which is if you're having a really hard time with your kid, put them in water or take them outside. There is a sensory overload aspect to a lot of the conflicts we face with our kids. So sometimes just having them take a bath or a shower or something, or kicking them outside in the backyard, or
turn on the sprinkler,
a nature walk, or do something, right? But like nature, like getting them outside or getting them in water, whatever that looks like. And I think it helps us too, right? Like there's times that I'm just like, I just need to get into the shower and have 15 minutes by myself where I'm not being yelled at. And then I can come out and just be a better parent. I don't know if we have anything like similar enough in politics where we can be like, everyone's just going to go take a bath and then come back and like, and talk about this more.
I mean, your question makes me wonder if communities near oceans have lower crime rates. So we can look for empirical evidence.
Yeah.
Community pools, lower rates of interpersonal violence.
There is a whole field of evolutionary aesthetics, and this is obviously true, and like you don't have to add the evolutionary part, but social psychology obviously focuses a lot on what we know about the way that the built environment affects people's mood and affects people's levels and all that kind of stuff. There is interesting evidence from evolutionary aesthetics that just being able to see a water source is relaxing for people, whether it's a pond, lake, river, or creek. And, the sort of like just so story about that, which I mean, it makes intuitive sense. I don't know if you can ever prove that it's accurate or not, is that humans feel less stressed when they know they have access to basic resources that they need, including things like water. I certainly feel less violent when I'm near a lake or an ocean.
That's been my experience too. Outside and water are the ultimate parenting hacks. So I think at the risk of sounding like utopians, we should talk about what this idea would look like in practice if we're talking about governance. One of the things I thought of is I've lived in small college towns now for a good chunk of my life since 2009. These small towns have some norms that differ from much bigger cities that I lived in. One of the ways I think of these is what I would call the repeat game. I think this is the economic term for it, right? Which is you can be aggressive with people who are driving in the area around you. You can be rude at the grocery store, but you will see those people again. Whereas in a
Yeah.
big city, like that's you may or you may not. You're a little bit more
Yeah.
anonymous. So there's probably some number of people under which it works to have this cooperative, voluntary, relational way of getting along with each other. Above some number, it's probably not. There's the Dunbar number of how many people, which I forget the different numbers, but
I
the
think Dunbar's
weakest
like
side.
150. Yeah.
Okay. The 150
Yeah.
though is like, is that your personal people that you know, or it's
People in your true network, like people that
okay.
you are capable of knowing and maintaining some kind of meaningful enough knowledge of them to call it a relationship.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
I don't know if anybody wants to live in cities of 150 people, or that's not a city, right? Even
No, like
even
a
this small
tribe.
town is more like a
Yeah.
tribe.
Yeah. I don't think Dunbar's argument was, and I don't think this was what you were saying either, but just for those listening, the argument I don't think is that 150 is like the ideal group size, but it is just a commentary on sort of like cognitive limitations that humans have. And so above 150, certain kinds of costs go up. So there's surveillance costs. Like one advantage of sort of around 150 is that like for to your point, like you kind of know what people are doing. My grandparents lived in rural Tennessee for a long time and their network probably was like 150 in terms of people that they actually knew and their neighbors was like five, you know. So they absolutely could keep an eye on things and they knew who was doing what. Their house would get broken into and they would know who it was, which is just like the mind boggles. But for like Sparta, Tennessee was an interesting place. But so as we get up above that, surveillance costs go up, all sorts of things go up. To your point, the likelihood that you're going to have another interaction with this person is
Mhm.
down as you get bigger. Campus communities are kind of interesting in that way, you know. But anyway, to your point about the numbers, you were going to add something else, and then I just took us off.
Oh, no. So we could contrast because I'm sure Rochester, where you are, is much larger than Pendleton, but Clemson is the college town. One of the things I also noticed, in addition to the aspect that's like the repeat game, is a sense of responsibility that's been really interesting to observe. There's a town Facebook page, and there's actually a couple of them, but in the Facebook page, people will post things like, oh, I saw a homeless couple. They're asking for change near Walmart. If you have anything that would help them, does anybody know of a shelter where they could stay? In really big cities, you get a diffusion of responsibility. Somebody else will deal with it. And you don't get that here. I bumped into somebody. So my town is very small. I bumped into a neighbor, a resident that I didn't know the other day. He was clearing out a gutter after a rainstorm that was nowhere near his house. I was laughing. That's your job. Thank you for doing that. And he said, well, if I don't, it doesn't seem to be anybody else's job. So he's just taking care of
Yes.
this, which is clearly road maintenance. Right? But it's
Yeah.
that sort of like, if you want it done, you will need to do it yourself. And that's really interesting to observe in this small town.
Mhm.
And like, I'm certainly not saying I don't want to have metropolitan cities. I enjoy them.
Yeah.
But you do lose that sense of like, I will have to do this if I want to see it done.
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting that I don't know if you're almost definitely familiar with Jane Jacobs. So she was a sort of urban planner, although she would have hated the word urban planner. She was like an urban anti-planner. But one of her defenses of city life is that at least sort of traditional cities actually were broken down into villages or hamlets. When I lived in the city of Rochester, I lived in a neighborhood called the South Wedge. The house I bought had been owned by one of my dad's classmates from high school, and his mom had lived it. So their family had owned that house for like 60 years or something like that. And it was a 2-bedroom house, and they raised 4 boys in a 2-bedroom house, which like the mind boggles. 1 bathroom. I was like, this is a starter home for us, but it was
It was their real home.
so the neighborhood was a mix of people who'd lived there for a really long time. And then what was changing it was actually renters. And that is where I think the iterative relationship piece, like, am I going to see this person? Do I have to live next to this person for the next 5 years? Am I not going to see them? Or am I never home enough to see them? The biggest problems we had were with renters because we couldn't have a stable relationship with them. Whereas our elderly neighbors or our middle-aged neighbors who had kids, like the people who are stable, we did get to know them. In Rochester, we get really big snowstorms. And what's really kind of neat about that is that because the state gets overwhelmed, they focus on arteries, which means your little side street in the city might not get plowed for like a couple days. People are shoveling each other's sidewalks. If they know
Mhm.
that there's an elderly person, they'll shovel
Mhm.
theirs. They help dig each other's cars out. And it's clearly reciprocal. If I dig someone's car out, the sort of like implied expectation is that
Yeah.
they're going to help me dig mine out. At one point, I had this amazing Oldsmobile, and there was a mail truck, one of those tiny little tin boxes that was spinning out and trying to get onto the main artery. I leaned out my window and gave the guy a thumbs up, and I just pushed with my huge Oldsmobile. I just pushed his mail truck like into the artery so that he could actually keep going. Um, One of the advantages of a giant used car. To your point, those kinds of spaces operate much more like small towns, right? They're
Mhm.
not the more anonymous parts of city life, like subways, where you are really in a totally anonymous space and
Mhm.
you don't know if you're going to see these people ever again. So there's also the other impact on that, of course, is levels of trust. If I know my neighbors, I have a pretty good understanding of whether I can trust them or not. Hopefully, I can trust them. But when I'm out in the sort of space, then trust becomes more of a question. And this is
Mhm.
where I think control comes in. Trust someone, I don't feel like I have to control them. Whereas if I don't know if I can trust that person or I just know nothing about them, then I might rely more on external trust mechanisms or external enforcement mechanisms. And I've been thinking a lot about the issues on the New York subway system where there's tension between the need to control random violence and theft against this you used to have a norm that, everyone minds their own business, but it's also relatively peaceful. I mean, I don't know if it's
Mhm.
ever been clean, but it was,
Right.
there's certainly it was a different space 40 years ago than it is now.
Mhm.
So the erosion of trust, I think, does start to trigger in people the desire to control
Yeah,
the environment.
absolutely.
In that desire to control the environment is that desire to control other people. To play devil's advocate against the sort of utopian version, what do we do? We're seeing that right now in the national conversation about illegal immigration, right? That's
Mhm.
one of the things that people are really, they want to control the border. They want to control other people by deporting them. They want to control other people. And that's partly because the trust has really broken down. People feel that the system is broken. So, anyway, that's the counterexample to our small scale utopian vision of trust based relationships. If you're planning a government or making a policy where trust is really low, our first inclination is to go to more draconian punishments. That's what we're seeing with immigration enforcement right now. The more untrusting we feel, the more comfortable we are with extremely severe or far reaching penalties. The punishment may spill over from people who merit the punishment onto people who don't.
Yep.
That assumption that more punishment is going to lead to more deterrence is not always correct. It doesn't do anything to restore trust. You would be better off trying to increase trust rather than doubling down on punishment or control. The other thing that came to mind when you were talking about trust is that the trust may or may not be merited. Where we have high trust within our community, that may not be warranted, just like our low trust may not be warranted. I don't know the attribution of somebody being trustworthy or not is very accurate, which is interesting because we're talking about how you could build a very communal, cooperative way of living in a community or a neighborhood, but it would be based on something that is not actually deeply accurate. One of my favorite stories of Sparta, Tennessee was I would visit my grandparents in the summers. Everyone
Yeah.
waves out the window when they drive by, no matter who you are. Some guy waved to my grandfather. We were sitting on the porch, and I said, "It's so nice that everyone waves around here." People actually do that in my neighborhood too. So it is like a quasi village kind of thing, even though it's a large suburb. My grandfather had this amazing, he's like, "Yeah, he'll wave at me out the window, and then he goes and dumps garbage on my land." And I was like, "Oh, well, okay. At least I guess you know that." At least he was appropriately cynical about some of the optics of trust. To that point, I think perception is such an important piece of this conversation because this plays into the immigration debate in a
Mhm.
big way. And I don't know what the solution is, but we know for a fact that illegal immigrants do not commit more crimes than American citizens, are actually more law abiding in many ways than American citizens. Crimes done by immigrants of all kinds get reported at higher levels. There's a fear response that gets kicked in. This goes back to our first conversation about in group. It's easy to believe because we see them as an out group, right? And so it's easy to say these people are a threat to me. And then if you keep consuming news that says that they're a threat to you, well, now you have this inaccurate perception. And so your trust level goes down and you're actually not able to assess accurately what is appropriate and what's not. And I think that's very much a kind of vicious cycle. And that's the vicious cycle that we're in right now, which is that we have inaccurate perceptions of people who come here for a variety of reasons. But then because we just keep consuming the media that fuels those inaccurate perceptions, our trust levels continue to decrease. And so there's no easy way out. I think both of us tend to come back to bottom up solutions a lot. The only way I think that you can really undo some of this is actually to get people in a room face to face and talk to each other. And so, but that's such a hard thing to scale because it's really time intensive and really resource intensive. So it does feel to me like we're kind of stuck in a damaging loop where we have these inaccurate perceptions that are reducing trust that lead to more authoritarian tendencies and this sort of desire to control. And we're seeing that really ramp up right now.
And I guess I think neither one of us are saying the solution is trust people more than you already do. Our point is if you could have an intervention that could enhance trust, that's how you would get more cooperative, pro-social behavior from everybody. I'm not saying the answer when you are uncomfortable with people breaking the law or behaving in a counterproductive way is just trust them and everything will be fine. We're saying if you could have repeat interactions, knowing each other, develop a sense of trust, you would get less of this bad behavior. And so then the question is, what kind of interventions would enhance trust? And so when getting back to the immigration example, I think one of the drivers of concern is the fact that the immigration system is so broken, right? It's like we are struggling to deal with the volume of people who are seeking asylum here, the volume of people who are in such dire straits that it makes sense to them to cross a border here and work illegally. And so it's like, well, if we could fix the system so that we had a working guest worker program, adjudicating the claims of people who want asylum rapidly, then we wouldn't be faced with a group of people saying, I feel unsafe and I'm fine with stopping people on the street and saying, showing them your papers. We're not saying to those people, calm down and trust people. We're saying, what is the underlying need that we can address that would change this? So maybe that's a little less utopian, right? We're not saying just trust. We're saying, help us figure out what you need.
Yes. So this is where I struggle a lot. On my Substack, I really try to focus on individual level interventions because I think when we focus on only structural interventions, like policy interventions, it tends to make people feel alienated. Like, I can't control what the federal government does. So why am I even thinking about this, right? So at the same time, though, I'm a political scientist. And so the structure of our decisions matters deeply. How we think about our social, political, and moral landscape is deeply constrained by the kinds of incentives that the broader policy framework creates. And of course, you also have to point out that the United States played a large role in destabilizing many of these Central and South American countries. So it's not like we are dealing with a group of people that we have no moral obligation to. Like, there's reasons that Central and South America is a mess right now, and it's largely due to U.S. influence in a variety of ways. I do think we missed the opportunities, and there are some really low-hanging fruit when it comes to some of the things you pointed out, right? Like, make it easier to adjudicate asylum requirements. Obviously, DACA should be such low-hanging fruit. These are people who were brought here as children. As long as they've lived blameless lives, it seems very obvious they should be granted citizenship. Those are the kinds of things you get in surveys of Americans really broad-based support for. And so it's just that those issues, because immigration itself has become so polarized that we're missing this cluster of policy solutions in the middle. They're not going to solve the problem of illegal immigration because there's always going to be these stable areas that people want to escape from. But it would increase people's trust in the system. It would increase trust that the system can work for them on both sides, the immigrant and the citizen side. And right now, we're not doing any of that or very limited amounts of that.
And I
So,
also think we're having this insane conversation about it too, right? Which is that we could be saying, tell us what your concerns are about immigration, but instead we've politicized the entire conversation, right? So that if
yeah,
you're somebody who wants more restrictive immigration laws, that probably means you're Republican. And it's like, okay, we're going to dismiss all of those concerns because of the in group, out group dynamic that's characterizing our politics right now. And that's not productive either. And if you think about like back to the parent model, like if you're trying to create harmony within your home, you're not going to be like, well, no, your concerns are totally invalid. Like you're going to hear them out because you need to understand them, right? Which in my case was like, but his Easter eggs are better than mine. That's the real issue, driving a whole afternoon of conflict, right? Like I still need to hear it and try to understand how it's working, even if it's not totally rational.
yeah, yeah. Well, and part of that too is that in order to address, and again, I'll use the spicy middle one. I would say 3/4 of the time, her whatever's causing conflict is irrational. It's something like, someone's dying Easter eggs better than me, or she has this very overdeveloped sense of justice. And so if anyone
Mhm.
gets something that is not exactly the identical thing that she does, but then if they do get that when she already has it, she gets mad about that too. So this is not an argument that kids are innately rational or humans
Right.
are innately rational. But if you treat them as though they are fundamentally irrational, that doesn't solve your problem either because
Yeah.
they're not fundamentally irrational. Humans in general are a combination of rational, irrational impulses and desires and misperceptions. We have to do a better job of asking people really like what is at your root? Like what is it that you want to see happen? Here's why, and maybe that can happen. And that's a good, helpful piece of information for people,
Mhm.
especially policymakers. But sometimes it can't happen. And then it's
Mhm.
really important to explain why. Like, here's the trade offs that would
Mhm.
require. Are you
Right.
okay with that trade off? Right. And sometimes people are just like, yes, perfectly comfortable with terrible things. They're like, oh, okay, we have to draw a line somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, but again, other times I think you can actually get to a better understanding of why things are the way they are. And I just don't see us doing that because we're in this deeply polarized space. It's easier to do it right now, parenting certainly, than on the larger scale.
I don't think the parties are set up to have a conversation with the other side about what is actually happening so we can address it. And that's where I think a nonpartisan conversation is really valuable because you can say there's an answer that's not open the borders or intercept people on the street and ask for papers. Neither of those things will address the underlying issue. And we're missing an opportunity that would make life better for everybody.
This goes back to one of the structural things that I don't know what to do about. So I sort of avoid writing about it because I just don't know what the answer is. I think there's a couple, but like, I don't know how you would start to get them into place. The incentives of our electoral system work against us in a lot of fundamental ways. And so that's partly why I like your work a lot. We're not going to get the main parties to support electoral reform because the system works to keep them in power. So why would they shoot themselves in the foot? But I do have a lot of hope that some of this reform can come from the bottom up. Maybe there are going to be these disruptive elements that might come in and start shaking loose some of that control. Um, and I don't think that's utopian, but I guess that's the sort of hope that I have.
Yeah, we could probably spend a whole episode talking about utopian communities. And I don't
Yes,
think that's where we're
absolutely
landing.
should. The trade offs of utopian communities would be a really fun episode.
Or
There's a lot
why
of
do they
thinking on that.
fail? That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
interesting too.
Well, we have 5 minutes left. One question we've been trying to ask ourselves at the end is
Mhm.
what are you hopeful or optimistic about these days or this week, I guess, in particular? So
Okay,
maybe
this
like
week in
really
particular.
tiny or bigger. Maybe we can start small.
This is kind of small, but something that's been really noticeable to me this week. I keep meeting people reaching out to me because of my work with the Independence Center and saying, I love what you're doing. How can I help? Tell me how I can help. I've never
Oh,
had a job
that
where people came to me and said,
I'd like to help you do your job.
So that's been really positive. It gives me a lot of hope for how much interest in the project of the Independent Center there ultimately is. It's been really exciting because sometimes I feel like I am tilting at windmills a little bit, trying to get some competition to the two major parties. That's been a nice feeling this week.
Nice.
Yeah. What's your
Yeah, mine's going to be much more minor because I've been really struggling with the news this week, just feeling as though a lot of the norms and expectations of liberal democracy, basic things like due process, people are not understanding why those are really important for everybody. As a political scientist, I'm feeling a little more depressed than usual, probably. Um, but I will say it's spring here in Rochester, which is really nice. So I do get a little more hopeful about that. I was actually encouraged. I was reading a couple articles online and a couple different outlets. And I will say that there were more productive conversations in the comments than I've seen before. I don't mean productive in the sense that they weren't contentious. And I don't mean productive in the sense that people agreed at the end. But what I did see this week, and it could have just been an anomaly, was more people taking the time to explain their point of view as opposed to just like immediately going for ad hominem attacks or like immediately
Mhm.
like calling someone a Nazi or whatever the insult du jour is. That felt hopeful to me that people are taking the time to have hard conversations, at least in those couple different outlets. So I don't know. Maybe we can get there. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe some things are shifting.
I
I will
I can only
hold
hope
out
so.
hope. Well, we're starting here. Yes, we're doing our
Well,
thing.
thank you, everyone, for joining us. We made this political with Laura, president of the Independent Center, and me, Lauren Hall, who writes at the Radical Moderate's Guide to Life on Substack. You should check out both of our work. I'm guessing you probably are familiar if you're here, but if not, please do. Any last words of wisdom, Laura, before we sign off?
We have to talk to people about their feelings. That's what I've learned in parenting
Children,
as a psychologist, as somebody working in politics. Sounds like that's both of our experience.
we at least have to ask the questions. Get curious. Maybe that's the lesson.
Be
Okay.
curious. I like it.
Thank you, everyone.